Thank you, Tommy. Y'all take your Bible. Let's go to Mark chapter number 10. Mark chapter 10, if you would. And let me... All right, Mark chapter 10 is where we're going to be this morning, and we're going to think about how Jesus gives his life as an act of service for all of us, but I want us to look at it in a little bit different way. Mark chapter 10, and we'll begin here in a moment in verse 32, and we'll, go down through verse 45. Years ago, there was a pastor by the name of Clovis Chappell. He was a very well-known guy. He was a Methodist preacher. And he told this story about two paddle boats that left Memphis headed for New Orleans. And they were both carrying cargo to New Orleans. And as they traveled down the Mississippi River, they kind of were close to each other, and sailors were calling from one boat to the next, and before you know it, there were some words that were exchanged and some challenges that were made, and you know how people are when they're competitive. It was on, man. The race was on. And so they began to race down the Mississippi River toward New Orleans. And one boat, sort of got behind, and it didn't have enough fuel. When they left Memphis, they had enough coal. They were coal driven, and they had enough coal to get them to New Orleans, but they didn't have enough coal for the race. And so they got behind. And so as it got behind, one of the sailors decided, well, I know what I'll do. And so they took some of the cargo and they tossed it in the oven. And they said, that'll burn about as well as coal. And so they began to burn the cargo as they raced down the Mississippi River. And so they ended up winning the race, but they burned all the cargo winning the race. Now, you may say, well, what does that have to do with anything? People today have a burning desire for success. And we will do just about anything to achieve that success, and we often don't count the cost of success. And sometimes to be successful costs us some of the precious things that God has given us to go down through life with. Let me give you an example personally. Years ago, my son, who is now 30 and married, lives on the Gulf Coast, was sitting in our home one Saturday morning, and I have always tried, not been successful, but I've always tried to keep Saturdays as a very special day for family and not do a lot of other things and not take a lot of calls and not take a lot of, needs, and just Saturday's family time. But anyway, I remember one Saturday morning during breakfast, the phone rang, and it was for me. And in the middle of getting my son something to eat, I had to take that call. And I'll never forget that he looked at his mother and he said, I ought to be more important than that phone call. But those calls are always important to Dad. And I realized that in my journey to be successful, I better be very careful that I didn't burn some precious cargo that the Lord had given to me. We often try to be successful, and it costs us a lot more than we want, because that day was like a kick in the stomach for me. And I have never forgotten that moment. Everybody wants to be successful. The football coach who wants to win the games, the insurance salesman, the car dealer, the business person. The person that comes to church wanting a handout, they want to be successful too. They want to get what they're asking you for. Everybody wants to be successful. And we teach our children to be successful. And we give them grades to let them know how they're doing on that path to success. If they're not doing very well, they get an F. If they're doing good, they get an A. And in church, we still have our same measure of success. Are the seats all filled? Is the, everything, is the plate full of money? Is everything going great? How are the nickels and noses? Because that's how we measure success in the church. How many noses and how many nickels? That's what it's all about. And we think that's the measure of success. Now listen, there's nothing inherently unholy about wanting to be a failure. You don't want that. That's not a goal that you have in life. And even the Bible tells us to recognize our potential. God has given all of us potential and capabilities. Jesus gives parables about a man who was given 5 talents, 1 2 talents, and the other 1. And the 5 and 2 talent guy who doubled theirs, well done, thou good and faithful servant. The 1 talent guy, he was cast into outer darkness because he didn't double his talent. And so the desire for success is not altogether an evil thing. But hear what I am going to tell you. We need to really analyze what our definition of success is. We define success the wrong way. Now you say, well, how do we define success? Well, we define success usually, and I could add to this, but there's at least 4 things I think that we define as being part of successful living. 1, we define our success by our possessions. How much do I have? How much material possessions do I have? And am I socially successful? That's important too. But we often think if we get a lot of stuff in life that somehow we're going to be successful. And if a person has money and they have a lot of things, that's how we grade it. And we teach our children these things. We start out when they're young, and we teach them little sayings. A penny saved is a penny earned, right? The early bird gets the worm. I mean, we teach them that a fool and their money is soon parted. And the message is, rise up early, work hard, defeat the competition, save what you have. That is the standard. And then we want them to go to school. We want them to do well. I wanted my kids to do well. And you should want yours to do well. And then we send them to college. Well, why, Dad, do I need to go to college? Well, so you can get an education. Well, why do I need an education? So you can get a job. Well, why do you want to get a job? So that you can get money. Well, what's so special about getting money? Well, then you can get all the things that'll make you happy in life. And so we define our success by our possessions. And one of the worst things in the world that many people think is when somebody dies and they say, he died broke. He died penniless. Well, I want to let you in on a little secret. You're going to die broke too. Because when you're dead, you ain't worth nothing. People say, when he died, he was worth $4 million. No, he wasn't. When he died, he didn't carry anything with him. We all break even in this life, but possessions is a very important part of our definition of success. And people are driven to that definition. I can remember when I was in school growing up that, people would purchase things that would make a statement about their success. And when I was in school, it was all about having either an Izod shirt or a polo shirt. Do y'all remember those days? I mean, if you got an Izod shirt and had the gator on it, man, that was a sign that your family was well enough off that they could buy you Izod shirts, or you could have a polo shirt or whatever. And that was a status symbol. That was the in thing to have. But a lot of kids, their parents couldn't afford those kind of things. They just were getting by, living paycheck to paycheck. And so they would go to JCPenney. And instead of buying the gator shirt, they would buy the fox. And if you showed up at school with a fox on your shirt instead of the gator, that was a good shirt. It was the same quality shirt as a gator, but it didn't have the status associated with it, because that gator just told everybody that you were somebody and your family was successful. And advertisers know this. When you watch car commercials on TV, they're not telling you about engines and tires and chassis and, all of that. They're telling you about how that'll bring you status and that'll bring you style, and you're somebody, man, and we're the right brand, right? It's all about success. Well, Jesus said that a man's life does not consist in the abundance of his what? Possessions. But yet that's not how we would think. But if you want to think about success in our world, it all begins there. But then I think another part of that definition that people have is position. We define a person by what they are, and we define whether they're successful by kind of what they do in this world. When you meet somebody for the first time, it's not 5 minutes into that conversation that you're going to ask them, what do you do? And you're going to judge that person based on that answer. What do you do? What position do you hold? If they tell you that they're the president of a company or some business person or whatever, you're going to think they're successful. If that job doesn't measure up, well, then you're going to think, well, you're not as good. And pastors do it too. You go to some pastor's conference and it's always a holy, well, brother, where do you serve? And if you say, well, I serve at New Ebenezer number 2 on the backside of Butcher Holler, they're going to say, well, you're not much. But if you say, well, I'm at the biggest church in the biggest town and I am somebody, then they're going to think that you're somebody special. I like to tell them I serve at Sand Ridge, and there was a time in the life of our church when we had an outdoor toilet committee. Y'all may think, really, yes, sir. You go back to 1967, read the minutes. There was a time in the life of this church when they didn't have indoor toilets and they had an outdoor toilet committee. And then they made a motion to have somebody bring in one for VBS so they'd have a place to go to the bathroom. And you think, that may not be anything to brag about. Well, look, we had a cotton committee once too around here. You said a cotton committee? You want to know how that building up there got paid for, that first sanctuary up there? That got paid for by people who'd go out and plant cotton. Somebody give them a plot of land. The church members would plant the cotton and pick the cotton. They had a cotton committee. And I want to tell you, I think they were pretty successful in my book. Listen, position doesn't mean success. An African-American preacher once heard said, Pharaoh had the title, Moses had the testimony. Nebuchadnezzar had the title, Daniel had the testimony. Jezebel had the title, but Elijah had the testimony. Herod had the title, but John the Baptist had the testimony. Pilate had the title, but Jesus is the one who had the testimony. And at the end of the day, I'd much rather have a testimony than I would a title, wouldn't you? I'd much rather be known for who I am than for what you think I am. But the third thing I think that we define success as is power. Possessions, position, power would be the third thing. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, we crave power. We crave control. People do. And the worst boss you'll ever have is somebody who loves to control instead of somebody who loves to produce. That's the worst boss you'll ever have. I once sat at the Mexican border for 3 hours because the man sitting on the other side of the desk had this little stamp, and I needed that little stamp. He had power. He could make my life miserable if he wanted to. And for 3 hours we sat there until we gave him what he wanted, which was about $20. Oh, and then we got our stamp. But he had the power to make it happen. And that craving for power is so strong in our life that if a person has no power at work and they have no authority, they'll often try to use their authority somewhere else. They'll go home and there'll be a little tyrant in the house. They'll come home and try to boss everybody around. They'll come home and want to kick the dog, make the dog do what they want because they don't have any power anywhere else. They're going to exercise it at home. Oh, by the way, that's true in the church too. I've often learned that the most unhappy person in the church is the person who has no power in their career because they won't come to church and want to get their way about everything there. Because we have that craving, we're going to exercise it somewhere. So don't be cantankerous just because you don't have power somewhere else. But the last thing is this. Not only possessions, not only positions, not only power, but I think the other part of an American definition of success is prestige. We like to have the respect of our friends and our coworkers, and we want people to think we are somebody. Years ago, I met a pastor, and I said, "Hey, can I call you Brother Bob?" Whatever his name was. He looked at me and he said, "No, you may not." He was Dr. Whistlebritches, I guess. And I thought to myself, well, I just won't call you anything then. How about that? I just won't say a word hardly to you. Because I wanted to say to him, I called Jesus by his first name. Are you more important than the Son of God? But his prestige had been injured by even somebody asking him about that. Listen, my point I want to make, get into Mark chapter 10, is this. That definition that we have of success is totally selfish. Every part of that is focused on selfish goals and selfish aims and is destructive. Look at Mark chapter 10. Look at verse 32. Now they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was going up before them, and they were amazed, and as they followed, they were afraid. Then he took the 12 aside. He began to tell them the things that would happen to them. And he said, "Behold, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and scourge him and spit on him and kill him. And the third day he will rise again." And he might as well have been tugging on Superman's cape and spitting into the wind, because they did not get one part of that. Jesus said, "I'm going to Jerusalem. They're going to beat me, scourge me, mock me. I'm going to die, but I'm going to rise on the third day." And it just went right over their heads. They didn't like that kind of thing because that wasn't the Messiah that they were looking for. They still had this idea that the Messiah was going to come and be a warrior, a liberator, to free them from Rome and to put them in power instead of the Romans and put Israel back to its place as a great nation in the history of the world. And so verse 35 says that James and John, after hearing that great teaching from Jesus about his future that they didn't pay attention to, that James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him and said, "Teacher, we want you to do whatever we ask." And if ever there's a question in the Bible that sounds like it was offered by a 5-year-old, that's it. Have you ever had your kids come up and say, "Daddy, I want to ask you a question, but you got to promise you won't say no"? Well, no good parent is going to say, "Yeah, just have at it. I'll just give you the, I'll give you the everything. The keys to the key. You can have it all." Nobody's going to do that. Well, James and John come and say, "Teacher, we want you to do whatever we ask. Give us a blank check." And you think about, why would they even ask such a dumb thing? And then you begin to study the context of where we are in the Gospel of Mark, and you begin to figure it out. And the reason they began to ask such a question, a childlike question, is because I think they were trying to take advantage of a leadership gap among the group. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you'll remember, we studied this a couple of weeks ago. Peter, James, and John had been taken up on the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus. Remember that? Peter, James, and John. Peter, James, and John. Peter, James, and John. And you always have Peter, James, and John. They're the inner circle of the 12. But Peter has kind of gotten on the outs a little bit because he couldn't keep his mouth shut. Because if you'll remember at Caesarea Philippi, Jesus had given this same teaching that he was going to die and be buried and rise from the grave. And Peter said, "Oh, no, that's not ever going to happen to you. That can't happen to you." And Jesus said, "Peter, you get behind me, Satan." And so they think that Peter is kind of on the outs and that they might have the inside track. And this would be a wonderful time for them, to join in with their hopes and their dreams of success, because Peter had somehow fallen out of favor with Jesus and they're going to take advantage of it. And so when Jesus begins talking about his death and his resurrection, they want to take advantage of Peter not being around. And not only that, but if you will remember your Bible history just a little bit, Peter was not family with Jesus. James and John were. James and John were first cousins. Their mother Salome and Mary were sisters, and so they were first cousins. And so here they say, "Man, we got a great opportunity. Peter's not really in a strong position anymore, and we're like the mob. Let's let the family rule, right? Let the family run the thing. And so they say, give us whatever we want. That's their thing. Their family, they think somehow they have the inside track. I mean, if you're going to establish a kingdom, if you're going to overthrow the Romans, if you're going to be an authority, why not keep all the power in the family, right? Why not keep it all close? Why not just keep everything right there in the family? They wanted to get in on the ground floor. They wanted to make sure they had their positions sewn up. They wanted to make sure that they were at the heart of this operation when everything came to be. What they wanted was to be successful. They wanted a little prestige, because James and John were nothing but simple fishermen, and they weren't even always good at that, mending their nets all the time. But they also had a bad attitude. You remember they were known as sons of thunder? Do you remember that? How in the world do you get the nickname Sons of Thunder? What do you do to get that? I've always said maybe they had racing stripes on their camel or something. What kind of a person would you have, to have that kind of a nickname? They were just a couple of hot-tempered country fishermen, but what they really wanted was to have power, and they wanted to have possessions, and they wanted to have prestige, and they wanted people to think something of them as they were in these new positions. They had this whole definition of success that they were trying to live up to as well. And let me remind you that James and John, even though they became devoted followers of Jesus, that old attitude they had didn't go away real easy. They were still hot-tempered in their old age. Let me ask you a Bible question. Who wrote the book of the Revelation? Does anybody know? Who wrote the book of the Revelation? Hello? Anybody listening? Who wrote the book of the Revelation? Do you remember? Philip Fulmer? Who wrote it? John. How old was he when he wrote it? He was in his 90s when he wrote it. He had been living in Ephesus and had been exiled to Patmos. But one of the interesting stories that comes to us from Irenaeus, an early church leader, tells about the time that John, when he moved to Ephesus, was going to go into a bathhouse, which was a big thing in the Roman world. And when he went into this bathhouse, he saw a guy in there by the name of Cerinthus. Now, Cerinthus was a man who was a docetic. He was a heretic. He believed that Jesus, never really took on flesh and blood, but he only had the appearance of a man, because he didn't believe that God could take on flesh and blood, and the docetics didn't believe Jesus came in the flesh. And so when John saw this man, Cerinthus, in the bathhouse, the historians say that he said this, and I quote, "Let us flee, lest even the bathhouse fall down, because Cerinthus, the enemy of the truth, is inside." John, as an old man, still had fire in the belly, man. He was still tough when he was old. And here's James and John, these hot-tempered country fishermen, never been among the elite of society. And when you break down what they wanted possessions to be in the service of the king. Meant you got what you desired. You had plenty. They wanted positions. When somebody said, "What do you do?" they wouldn't say, "We run a smelly old fishing boat." They would say, "We're on the right and the left hands of the king." They wanted power. They had never been able to rule over anybody else. Now they wanted to rule over somebody else. And they wanted that prestige. They wanted to be called sir and yes sir. That's what they wanted. But I want you to notice that, like most people, their definition of success is very selfish, and Jesus is going to straighten them out. In Mark chapter 10, look what he says when they ask their 5-year-old question. When they ask their 5-year-old question, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask." Look at verse 36. He says, "Well, what do you want me to do for you?" And they said, "Grant us that we may sit on your right hand, one of us, and the other on your left hand in your kingdom." The right and the left are always the places of authority. They were the places of prestige and power. They were places of glory. Because if you sat on the right hand of the king and you were eating your meal, you would lean on your left hand, and you could lean into the king and tell him whatever you wanted to tell him. But if you sat on the left hand, then the king was on the right hand, and if he wanted to have a conversation with you, he would lean to his left and right into you. These were high positions that they wanted. They wanted to be on his right, and they wanted to be on his left. But Jesus says, what do you want me to do? And they said, "Grant us." And I want you to look at verse 38, he says, you don't know what you're asking. You don't know what you ask. I don't know, have you ever had somebody that didn't know what they asked? Have you ever been in a case like that? I was flying home from a mission trip in Japan with a friend of mine, a wonderful guy. I loved him to death, and he's a great fellow. But we were flying home, and he was just a good old Southern boy. And he wanted, when the stewardess came by and said, "Can I get you anything?" he wanted some tomato juice. And he looked over at somebody else on the plane, and he thought they were drinking tomato juice and said, "I'll just have what he's got." And so they brought him this red drink, and he took a big swig of it. He said, "I think they brought me a Bloody Mary." I said, "You don't know what you were asking. You had no idea what you were doing. Here you are on the mission trip wanting tomato juice, and they bring you a Bloody Mary on the plane. You don't know what you're talking about." Well, that's James and John. Jesus says in verse 38, you don't know what you're asking. And then he says to them, "Are you able to drink the cup that I drink? And are you able to be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" Now the cup referred not to his death, but the reason for his death. He said in Gethsemane, "Take this cup from me," that cup of sin that he would drink for the world. That cup was filled with the sin of all humanity. And then when he talks about baptism, that refers to his burial, his death, and his resurrection. And it's an Old Testament metaphor for being overcome with calamity. And he's asking them, can you be submerged in calamity and suffering like I will be? Can you take upon yourself sin? Will you be able to suffer like I am? And their answer, of course, is verse 39, "We're able. Of course we can. We can do this thing. We're with you." And just let me say that James and John both got their request. Jesus says in verse 39, "You'll drink the cup that I drink, and with the baptism I'm baptized with, you'll be baptized." He said, it's going to happen. And let me tell you, they both got their request. Do you know how James died? James died a martyr under Herod Agrippa. It's recorded in the book of Acts, and he was beheaded. Very early in the life of the church, he was killed. John lived to be an old man, but he was exiled to Patmos for preaching the gospel. And whether he died of forced labor there or released, those things are uncertain. But either way, he suffered and he died for his Savior. They did get baptized with that baptism of suffering. But notice what happens. Verse 40, "To sit on my right and my left," he said, "is not mine to give, but it's for those whom it is prepared." Jesus said, that's not up to me. That's the Father's will. But verse 41, here's the conversation. The other 10 finally heard about it. "And when the 10 heard about it, they began to be greatly displeased with James and John." Now, they heard what was going on and they were mad. I'll bet Peter was hot. I'll bet Judas Iscariot was hot. Because they both had ambition. You know what Judas has led him to do, right? To betray him. And so the other 10 are angry, and you've got to ask, why are they so mad? Here's why. They felt like they got beat to the punch. They felt like they got beat to the question. They wanted right and left just as bad as anybody else did. The reason that they got mad at James and John was because of ENVY. They were envious. And they had been outmaneuvered. And they felt like James and John were trying to close family ranks. They felt like the day of glory was getting near and they didn't want to be left out. And they are envious. Now let me just stop here while I am in the neighborhood and remind you that envy is a very dangerous sin, and it is a very common sin. Proverbs 14 verse 30 says, a heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones. Envy rots your soul. Envy caused Cain to kill his brother Abel. Envy led the brothers of Joseph to sell him into slavery to a caravan of Ishmaelites. Envy put Daniel in the lion's den. Envy destroys our relationship. When you look at some other person with envy and you wish you had the things that somebody else possesses, that relationship is in danger. I've known families that have been destroyed over envy. One relative resents his siblings because they've achieved more than they have, and envy destroys families. Envy is a destroyer. Envy. Cain envied Abel standing before God. Joseph's brothers envied his relationship with Jacob, and they sold him. Saul envied David's popularity with the nation. Saul has slain his thousands, David his 10,000s, and he tried to kill him. Lucifer envied God's exalted position, and so he rebelled and wanted to be like God, and the world's been in a mess ever since. Envy is a destroyer. It destroys relationships. It destroys whatever it touches. It steals our ability to enjoy life. And that is why the ancient Christians called it one of the 7 deadly sins, because it will steal the joy out of your life. Let me give you an example. Pardon me. A family had a wonderful son, a terrific, terrific child, who was full of life and energy and joy and just a blessing. But they wanted their son to be a professional person, a doctor, a lawyer, somebody that was a professional. But their son wanted to work with his hands, and he was good at working with his hands, and he enjoyed working at his hands. He was creative and talented, and he was very successful at what he did. But they envied their friends who had children who were professionals and had these prestigious vocations, and that young man always was put down by the negative attitude of his mama and his daddy, and they are the ones who lost out on the opportunity to have a joyful, wonderful, amazing relationship with a talented son because they envied their neighbors who had what they wanted. That kind of thing happens all the time. And envy hurts the one who possesses the envy. Cain was cursed to be a vagabond and a fugitive because of the murder of his brother. Saul was eventually killed by his enemy, and his rival David replaced him as king. Lucifer was evicted from heaven and condemned to a lake of fire because of envy. Envy destroys the one who is envious. And so here in Mark chapter 10, you have you have James and John. They're wanting the right and left hands. The other here, they're mad too because their envy of the aggressive nature of James and John leads them to hate James and John. This is a toxic situation. Envy destroys the one who possesses it. And if you have envy about something in your life, it's going to hurt you. Let me give you an example. Jews have written many, many things through the years, the Talmud, the Mishnah, all kinds of comment. They've written many, many, many things. There's an old Jewish story that they would use to teach about envy. It goes like this. A Jewish merchant hated his rival merchant who had a store next door. Hated him. One day an angel comes to this merchant and says, I will give you anything that you wish, with one caveat. Whatever you get, your neighbor will get double what you get. And the Jewish store owner, without hesitation, said, then I wish to be blind in one eye. Here's a man willing to destroy his own sight to destroy his friend, or his enemy, or his rival. Envy has that kind of power in our life. We don't think of it like that, but envy comes from a misunderstanding of success. It comes from a false definition of success, and it's bred out of a desire to have what other people have. And these 10 disciples were torn apart by envy, and so Jesus has to straighten them all out. And I want you to notice what he says. Look in verse 42. Jesus calls them to himself. And he says, you know that those who are considered rulers over the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. Whoever desires to become great among you shall be your what? your servant. And whoever of you desires to be first shall be slave of all. And never forget that even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Excuse me. He says to them, you don't understand what success is. Success is not possessions and power and prestige and positions in this world. What success really is servanthood, giving, serving, doing for other people. That's what true success is. Because if you gain, and hear this, if you gain everything in this world, all the possessions you want, the power you want, the position you want, the prestige that you want, what good is that going to do you in the end? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Because one day, you're going to stand before God, and all your possessions are going to look silly compared to the one who's created all things. One day you're going to stand before God, and all your power is going to look weak in comparison to the one who has all power in heaven and on earth. And all the positions you've got are going to look pretty low compared to standing before the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and all the prestige you think you've earned will come to nothing when you're before the one before whom every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Son of God and He is Lord of all. I'm just telling you, don't buy in to what the world says success really is. Let me ask you this. Do you think Jesus was successful? Well, he was born in a barred stable, and he grew up in a place that had a terrible reputation. Nothing good could come out of Nazareth. He spent the last 3 years of his life camping out with 12 nobodies, one of whom turned him into the authorities. He ate his last meal in a barred room. He had no place to lay his head. He rode into Jerusalem on a barred donkey. He died the death of a common criminal. He was buried in a borrowed tomb. And from all outward indications, Jesus was a failure. Was Jesus a failure? Absolutely not. If we define success the way we define it and apply that to Jesus' life, he would be a nobody. But greatness, Jesus says, is determined by service. Look at verse 44. Whoever desires to be first shall be slave of all. The word slave means somebody totally owned by another and who has no rights of their own except those given by the master. Look in verse 43. He says, whoever desires to become great shall be your servant. Do you see that? That word is deacon, by the way. Diakonos, the deacon. Deacon is not about an office, it's about an activity. It's about servanthood. And a deacon, a diakonos, was a servant whose job included the lowest things. You would wash the feet of those who entered the house. A servant who did the menial jobs. That's what Jesus is talking about. And Jesus said, if you want to be great, you need to be somebody who takes care of others, who serves others, who pours your life into others, who doesn't look out for number one, and who doesn't think only about themselves. Now let me ask you, is that the world we live in today? It's not. I have a book in my office called Looking Through the Stained Glass Windows. I've had it for years. John Ronsvalley and Sylvia Ronsvalley wrote that book, and they tell in that book about this man who comes to church and joins the church, and then the pastor asks him, hey, would you like to be in my Bible study? I'd love to disciple you. I'd love to talk to you about being a closer disciple of Jesus. And here's what the guy says. He said, preacher, if you got a bill to pay, you let me know and I'll do my part. And if you need a pie for the bake sale, I'll ask my wife to make one. He said, but nobody mentioned sacrifice when I joined this church. We live in a generation of people who are takers and not givers. What we need to remember is that Jesus defined success far differently than we do. And his definition of success is this. Look in verse 45. That even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to what? Serve. And to give his life as a ransom for many. The most successful thing that ever happened was when somebody died. His name is Jesus, who gave his life as a ransom for many. He died in our place. And his servanthood toward us is what makes him a success. You want to know what success is? It's all about dying to self and giving to others. And until we have that attitude, all the money in the world ain't going to make you a success. And all the titles aren't going to make you a success. Years ago, I read about this little boy and little girl. Supposedly a true story. They were brother and sister, and the little girl was very, very sick, and the only way she had any hope of living was through a blood transfusion. And in that day, they looked at her little brother, and he had the right blood and the right stuff in his blood. And so they asked him, they said, "Johnny, would you be willing to give your blood so that your sister could live?" And little Johnny paused for a second, and his lip began to quiver, and there was hesitation. And then he said, "Yeah, I'll give her my blood." And so they took him to the hospital. They hooked them both up, and he watched his blood begin to drain out, and it began to go and be life-saving and life-giving for his sister. And while he's laying there giving the transfusion, he looks over at the doctor and he says, "Doc, when do I die?" And it was in that moment that that doctor realized why the trembling lip and why the moment of hesitation. Because that little boy thought that in giving his blood to his sister, he was giving up his own life. That's what it means to serve. Not thinking of self, but thinking of others. And that's what it means to be a success. Father, make us successful in your sight. Lord, help us to follow the admonition given in Scripture that we should do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others above ourselves, and that our attitude should be the same as that of Jesus Christ, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but took upon himself the very form of a servant and humbled himself and became obedient to death, even the death of the cross. And so help us to be like Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. God bless you guys. Thank you all very much.